Vivian Ashford stood in the middle of a crowded cafe, her phone pressed between her ear and shoulder, her voice clipped and urgent as she handled yet another corporate crisis. Somewhere behind her, tucked into a corner booth, her 6-year-old daughter Sophie sat with her head bowed, small fingers clutching a worn teddy bear. The cochlear implant that usually connected Sophie to the hearing world had gone silent, the battery dead, the device useless. A barista with kind eyes knelt down to Sophie's level without saying a word. His hands began to move in smooth, deliberate motions. "I like your bear. What's his name?" Sophie looked up. For the first time in months, her eyes brightened, and a small, tentative smile broke across her face. Vivian turned around just in time to see it. Her phone slipped from her hand and clattered against the floor. 6 years earlier, Vivian had sat in a sterile hospital room while a doctor delivered news that would reshape her entire world. Sophie was deaf. Congenitally, profoundly deaf. The words had felt like stones dropping into still water, sending ripples through every plan Vivian had ever made for her daughter. In that moment, sitting beneath the harsh fluorescent lights with her newborn in her arms, she had sworn to give Sophie everything the best cochlear implant money could buy, the most acclaimed speech therapists in Oregon, enrollment in an elite, specialized school that promised to mainstream deaf children into the hearing world. She would fix this. She would make her daughter's life as normal as possible. But in all those promises, in all those desperate calculations, Vivian had never once considered learning American Sign Language. The implant will help her live normally, she had told herself, over and over, until she almost believed it. The doctors had assured her it was the right choice. The specialists had nodded approvingly at her commitment to oral education. And Vivian, who had built her entire career on making the right strategic decisions, had trusted them completely. Now, standing in Morning Light Cafe with her phone at her feet and her daughter smiling at a stranger, Vivian felt the full weight of that decision crushing down on her chest. She was in the most stressful period of her professional life. Ashford Wellness Group, the spa and wellness chain she had built from nothing over 12 grueling years, was weeks away from its IPO. The company had started as a single location in a tired strip mall, born from Vivian's conviction that wellness should be accessible and unpretentious. Now it had grown into a regional empire with 47 locations across the Pacific Northwest, and investment bankers were projecting a valuation that made her head spin. The nanny who usually cared for Sophie had called in sick that morning, leaving Vivian with no choice but to bring her daughter along to her downtown meetings. The cafe was supposed to be a quick stop, a 15-minute break between investor calls, a chance to grab coffee and answer emails while Sophie sat quietly with her coloring books. Vivian watched as the barista continued signing with Sophie. His movements were patient and unhurried, his face animated with expression in a way that seemed to transform the signs into something almost musical. Sophie's hands moved in response, slowly, uncertainly, like someone speaking a language they had nearly forgotten. But she was engaged. She was present. She was communicating in a way Vivian had never witnessed before, her whole body leaning forward with eagerness. Something cracked open inside Vivian's chest. She felt it splinter, a mixture of guilt and jealousy and deep burning shame that spread through her like ice water. This man, this complete stranger in a green apron, had connected with her daughter in 2 minutes. 2 minutes. And in 6 years, despite all the money she had spent, despite all the specialists she had hired, despite every resource she had poured into making Sophie normal, Vivian had never managed to do the same. She had given Sophie everything except the one thing that mattered most, a way to truly speak to her own mother in the language that came most naturally to her. Vivian bent down to retrieve her phone, her hands trembling slightly. The screen showed 3 missed calls and 17 new emails, all of them urgent, all of them demanding her attention. But for once, she could not bring herself to care. When she straightened, she found herself walking toward the counter, drawn by something she could not name and did not want to examine too closely. The barista had returned to his station, but his eyes still held warmth when they met hers. His name tag read Marcus. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with sandy brown hair that curled slightly at his collar, and the kind of face that suggested he smiled often, even when the world gave him reasons not to. There were lines around his eyes, not from age, but from the kind of pain that leaves permanent marks. Vivian approached the counter, forcing herself to maintain the composed expression she wore in boardrooms and shareholder meetings. But her voice came out softer than she intended when she spoke. "Where did you learn sign language?" Marcus wiped down the espresso machine, his movements easy and practiced, the kind of automatic gestures that came from years of repetition. "I was a special education teacher for 7 years," he said. "Taught at a school for deaf and hard-of-hearing kids over in southeast Portland. Wilson Academy, you might have heard of it." He paused, something flickering behind his eyes like a candle in wind. "After my wife passed, I needed a job with more flexible hours. My son Ethan, he's 9, he needed me around more. Needed someone to be there when he got home from school, someone to help with homework, someone to just be present. Teaching didn't allow for that anymore." Vivian absorbed this information. "I'm sorry about your wife," Marcus nodded, a small acknowledgement of pain that never fully went away. "Her name was Lily. She was deaf, had been since birth." He glanced over at Sophie, who was still sitting in the booth, now tracing patterns on the table with her finger, her teddy bear propped beside her like a silent companion. "Your daughter reminds me of her, actually. The same quiet strength. The same way of watching the world like she's taking notes on everything, filing away observations that hearing people miss entirely." Vivian felt something shift in her perception. The man before her was no longer just a barista, he was someone who understood, who had lived in the silent world her daughter inhabited. Before she could respond, Sophie appeared at her side, tugging at her hand with unusual urgency. Her small hands moved rapidly, signing with an excitement Vivian rarely saw. "She's asking if we can come back," Marcus translated gently, his eyes crinkling with warmth. "She wants to know if you'll bring her here again." Vivian hesitated. Her schedule was meticulously planned down to 15-minute increments, color-coded and synchronized across 3 devices. There was no room for unplanned coffee shop visits, no space in her calendar for anything that did not directly contribute to the IPO's success. Every hour was accounted for, every commitment weighed against its potential return on investment. But then she looked down at her daughter's face, at the hope shining in those dark eyes, at the eager way Sophie's hands still moved, signing "please, please, please," and found herself nodding. "We'll come back," she heard herself say. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Sophie's smile reached all the way to her eyes, transforming her small face into something radiant. 3 days later, Vivian found herself pushing open the door to Morning Light Cafe, with Sophie's hand clasped in hers. She had rearranged 2 meetings and declined a lunch with potential investors to make this happen, and some part of her brain was still calculating the cost the relationship capital expended, the opportunities potentially missed, the whispered questions from colleagues about her priorities. But Sophie had talked about nothing else since their first visit, or rather, she had signed about nothing else, her small hands moving with an animation Vivian had never seen before, describing the kind barista and the warm cafe, and the wonderful feeling of being understood. Marcus was behind the counter again, but this time he was not alone. A boy with the same sandy hair sat at a small table near the window, a sketchbook open before him, colored pencils scattered across the surface. When he saw Sophie, his face lit up with uncomplicated delight. He waved enthusiastically and began signing, his movements slower and more deliberate than his father's but clearly practiced. "Hi, I'm Ethan. Want to draw?" Sophie looked up at her mother, uncertainty flickering across her features like clouds passing over sun. Vivian nodded encouragingly and watched as her daughter crossed the cafe to slide into the seat across from Ethan. Within minutes, the 2 children were bent over the sketchbook together, crayons scattered between them, their hands moving in a mixture of signing and pointing, and the universal language of childhood friendship that transcended all barriers. Vivian ordered a coffee she did not particularly want and settled into a booth where she could watch Sophie while answering emails. For 20 minutes, something close to peace settled over her, a rare sensation, almost foreign after years of constant pressure. The cafe was warm and smelled of fresh coffee and cinnamon, and the sound of children's laughter, mixed with the gentle hiss of the espresso machine, created a kind of ambient music that soothed something raw inside her. Then her phone rang. Diana Mercer's voice was tight with controlled urgency. Diana was the longest-serving member of Ashford Wellness's board of directors, a woman who had been close friends with Vivian's mother before she passed. "We have a situation," Diana said without preamble. "One of the spa branches in Lake Oswego, there are allegations about labor practices. A disgruntled employee went to the press. This close to the IPO, we need to get ahead of it. I need you in the conference room in 45 minutes. Vivian's stomach tightened. "I'll be there in 30 minutes. She ended the call and looked over at Sophie, who was laughing at something Ethan had drawn, actually laughing. A sound Vivian heard so rarely that it made her heart ache with its sweetness. The two children had their heads bent together over the paper, and Sophie was signing something that made Ethan giggle in response. Vivian could not take her daughter away from this. Not now. Not when Sophie had finally found a friend who could speak her language. Marcus appeared at her table as if summoned by her distress. "Everything okay?" "I have to go back to the office," Vivian said, the words feeling like a betrayal as they left her mouth. "It's an emergency, a PR situation that could affect the IPO. I thought I'd have more time." But she stopped, hating how helpless she sounded, how torn between two impossible demands. "Could you watch her? Just for 30 minutes? I'll be back as soon as I can." Marcus glanced at Sophie and Ethan, who were now collaborating on an elaborate drawing of what appeared to be a dragon with multiple heads and a crown. "Of course," he said simply, and there was no judgment in his voice, no calculation of what she might owe him in return. "Take whatever time you need. They're having a great time together." The meeting ran long. The 30 minutes stretched into an hour as lawyers were consulted and statements drafted, then 90 minutes as the communications team debated messaging, then 2 hours as Diana insisted on reviewing every word of the press release. By the time Vivian burst back through the cafe door, breathless and apologizing profusely, the afternoon light had shifted to the golden glow of early evening, and the cafe had taken on the intimate atmosphere of a place preparing to close. She found Sophie still at the table with Ethan, but now there were multiple drawings spread between them, dragons and castles and fantastical creatures, each one more elaborate than the last, and Sophie was signing animatedly, telling Ethan a story about the characters they had created together. Her hands moved with confidence, her face alive with expression, her whole body engaged in the narrative. Vivian stopped short in the doorway. Sophie was not just signing, she was laughing between the signs, her whole face alive with the kind of unguarded joy that Vivian had almost forgotten existed. This was not the polite, guarded smile Sophie gave to adults when she was expected to perform happiness for their benefit. This was real joy, unguarded and complete, and it was the most beautiful thing Vivian had ever seen. Marcus appeared beside her, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He offered one to Vivian, who took it gratefully, wrapping her fingers around the warm ceramic. "She has a lot to say," he observed quietly, watching the children with a gentle smile. "She just needs someone who knows how to listen." The words hit Vivian like a slap, gentle, but devastatingly accurate. She had spent 6 years trying to make Sophie fit into the hearing world, pouring money into devices and therapies and specialists who promised to teach her daughter to speak with her voice. Never once had she considered that she might need to enter Sophie's world instead, to learn the language of hands and faces and movement that was her daughter's true native tongue. All those specialists, all those therapies, all those expensive devices, and what Sophie had needed most was simply someone who could hear her in the only language that was truly hers. Vivian started bringing Sophie to the cafe 3 times a week, then 4, then nearly every day. She told herself it was for Sophie's benefit, the friendship with Ethan, the opportunity to practice signing with someone who understood, the simple joy of feeling seen and understood. But somewhere in those visits, amid the warm smell of coffee and the sound of children's laughter, Vivian began to acknowledge a truth she had been avoiding for longer than she wanted to admit. She liked it here, too. In Morning Light Cafe, no one knew she was a CEO. No one needed her to approve budgets or review contracts or make decisions that affected hundreds of employees. No one was calculating her worth or measuring her performance against quarterly projections. She could just be Sophie's mother, sitting in a warm corner booth, watching her daughter bloom like a flower finally given sunlight. One afternoon, as Sophie and Ethan worked on their latest artistic collaboration, a sprawling mural of an underwater kingdom populated by signing mermaids, Vivian decided to try something that had been building in her mind for weeks. She had been watching Marcus sign, picking up phrases here and there, practicing in front of her bathroom mirror late at night like a teenager preparing for a school play. The movements had started to feel natural in her hands, though she knew her technique was clumsy. She walked over to Sophie and knelt down to her level, her heart pounding in her chest. Sophie looked up, curious, her crayon pausing mid-stroke. Vivian took a breath and moved her hands carefully, forming the signs she had practiced 100 times in secret. "I love you." Sophie's eyes went wide. For a moment, something flickered across her face, hope, disbelief, a desperate kind of wanting that made Vivian's heart clench. Then, slowly, Sophie's expression shuddered like a window closing against cold. She turned away, her small shoulders hunching forward, and returned to her drawing without response. Vivian felt the rejection like a physical blow to her chest. She stood up slowly, her hands falling useless to her sides, and walked back to her booth on unsteady legs, the coffee she had ordered growing cold and forgotten. Marcus followed a moment later, sliding into the seat across from her with the easy grace of someone accustomed to navigating emotional minefields. "Kids know when words are real," he said, his voice gentle but direct, carrying no judgment but also no false comfort. "And when they're just motions." Vivian's defenses flared automatically, the instinct to protect herself that had served her so well in business. "I do love her. I don't doubt that." Marcus leaned forward slightly, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made deflection impossible. "But love in your language isn't love in hers. Not yet. You're speaking to her in signs, but you're not speaking to her in relationship. Does that make sense?" The truth of it settled over Vivian like a weight she had been refusing to carry. She had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on Sophie's cochlear implant, on speech therapy sessions that lasted years, on specialists who flew in from across the country to evaluate her daughter's progress. But she had never invested 100 hours in learning Sophie's language, the language of her hands, her expressions, the eloquent silence that was not silence at all, but a whole world of communication that Vivian had never bothered to enter. "Would you teach me?" The words came out before Vivian could stop them, raw and desperate in a way that would have horrified her in any boardroom. "Sign language. Would you teach me properly?" Marcus studied her for a long moment, his gaze measuring something she could not see. Then he nodded. "We can start after the cafe closes tonight. Ethan can keep Sophie company while we work." For the first time in weeks, Vivian felt something loosen in her chest, something that might have been hope, fragile but real. The lessons began that evening and continued 3 times a week, always after Morning Light closed its doors to regular customers. Sophie and Ethan would play in the corner booth, while Marcus guided Vivian through the basics of ASL, the alphabet, common phrases. The grammar that was so different from spoken English that it sometimes made her head spin. Vivian was a perfectionist by nature, accustomed to mastering everything she attempted through sheer force of will, and her early failures frustrated her deeply. Her hands felt clumsy, her expressions wooden, her timing always slightly off. "You're thinking too much," Marcus said during their 3rd lesson, as Vivian struggled to convey a simple sentence about the weather. ASL isn't just grammar and vocabulary, it's emotion, expression. Your face is as important as your hands. You have to feel it. Vivian lowered her hands, embarrassment warming her cheeks. I'm not good at feeling things in front of people. I've spent my whole career learning to hide what I feel. Marcus smiled, and there was understanding in it, the recognition of one guarded person by another. Neither was I, once. I was raised in a house where showing emotion was considered weakness. Lily taught me different. She taught me that silence isn't empty. It's full of things words can't hold, whole conversations that happen in the space between gestures. At the mention of his wife's name, something shifted in the air between them, becoming more charged, more intimate. Vivian had gathered fragments of the story over the weeks that Lily had been deaf since childhood, that she and Marcus had met when he was a young teacher full of idealism, that she had died 4 years ago, but she sensed there was more beneath the surface, whole oceans of grief and guilt that he kept carefully contained. "How did you meet her?" Vivian asked, the question slipping out before she could second-guess its propriety. Marcus's hands stilled on the table. For a moment, she thought he would not answer, would retreat behind the pleasant professionalism of a barista making small talk with a customer. Then he began to speak, his voice low and measured, as if he were handling something fragile that might shatter at too rough a touch. I was 24, fresh out of my teaching credential program, absolutely terrified of my first classroom. I had learned sign language in college because I thought it would make me more employable, but I had no idea what I was doing with actual deaf students. Lily was volunteering at the school. She had grown up in the deaf community and wanted to help hearing teachers understand what their students actually needed, not what textbooks said they needed. A ghost of a smile crossed his face, softening the lines of old grief. She told me later that she knew I was hopeless the moment she saw me trying to sign the morning announcements. Said I looked like a drowning man trying to conduct an orchestra. But she stuck around anyway, stayed after school to help me practice, taught me that ASL wasn't just a tool for communication, it was a culture, a community, a whole way of being in the world. "She sounds remarkable," Vivian said softly. She was. Marcus's gaze drifted to the window, to the darkening street beyond, where Portland's evening rain had begun to fall. "She taught me that the deaf world isn't a lesser version of the hearing world. It's not a disability to be fixed or overcome. It's its own world, complete and beautiful, with its own art and humor and poetry. I just had to learn how to see it. And once I did, I couldn't imagine going back." Vivian waited, sensing there was more, that he was building toward something painful that needed to be said. "The accident was 4 years ago," Marcus continued, his voice dropping further until it was barely above a whisper. "We were driving back from a weekend trip to the Coast Cannon Beach, Lily's favorite place. It was raining, and I was tired, and I should have pulled over at that rest stop near Seaside, but I wanted to get Ethan home to his own bed. He'd had a long weekend, and he was cranky, and I just wanted to be home." His hands clenched on the table, knuckles whitening. A truck crossed the median. I saw it coming, had maybe 2 seconds to react. I tried to swerve, tried to protect her side of the car, but the physics were all wrong, and he stopped, swallowed hard. I woke up in the hospital 3 days later. Ethan had been in the back seat, strapped into his booster chair. He walked away with bruises and nightmares. Lily was in the passenger seat. She didn't make it past the first hour. "You blame yourself," Vivian said softly. It was not a question. Marcus did not deny it. "Every day. Every single day since. I tell myself it wasn't my fault the other driver was drunk, the road was slick. 1,000 things went wrong at once that I couldn't have controlled. The police said there was nothing I could have done differently that would have changed the outcome. But I was driving. I made the choice to keep going when I should have stopped. I survived. She didn't." He met Vivian's eyes, and she saw the wound that still lived behind his calm exterior, raw and permanent and unhealing. "You learn to carry it. You don't get over it. You just learn to walk with the weight." In that moment, Vivian understood something essential about the man before her. He was not simply kind, not simply patient, not simply a good person doing his best. He was someone who had learned to live with broken pieces, who had chosen to keep showing up every day, even when the weight of loss threatened to pull him under. And in recognizing that, she recognized something in herself too, the same brokenness, the same desperate attempt to function around the edges of pain, the same fear that if she stopped moving for even a moment, the grief would swallow her whole. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it in a way that encompassed more than condolences. "For everything you've been through. For everything you're still going through. For the weight you carry." Marcus nodded, accepting her words as the gift they were. Then he straightened, pulling himself back from the edge of grief with visible effort, reassembling the calm exterior that let him function in the world. "Your turn," he said, his voice deliberately lighter. "Show me the phrase again. And this time, feel it." Vivian raised her hands and began to sign, and something in her chest shifted, opened, allowed the words to mean what they said. The IPO preparation intensified as November wore on, consuming Vivian's days and bleeding into her nights until she could barely remember what rest felt like. Investor meetings multiplied exponentially. Due diligence documents demanded review and re-review. Conference calls stretched across time zones, connecting Portland to New York to London to Hong Kong. For an entire week, Vivian did not make it to Morning Light Cafe. She told herself it was temporary, that Sophie would understand, that the sacrifice now would pay dividends later. When she finally returned on a gray Thursday afternoon, her eyes shadowed from lack of sleep and her soul worn thin from endless negotiations, Sophie was different. The warmth that had begun to kindle in her daughter's eyes over the past weeks had dimmed to something cold and distant. Sophie sat with Ethan at their usual table, crayons between them, but her movements were mechanical, joyless. When Vivian approached, Sophie did not look up. She did not sign hello. She did not acknowledge her mother at all. Vivian's heart contracted painfully. "Sophie? Honey?" Sophie continued drawing, her small hand moving mechanically across the paper, producing shapes that held no meaning or life. Ethan glanced between them, clearly uncomfortable with the tension he could feel but not understand, then slipped away to find his father. A moment later, Marcus appeared at Vivian's side. "She's been asking about you," he said quietly, his voice carefully neutral. "Every day. And every day I had to tell her you weren't coming. I had meetings. The IPO. I know." Marcus's voice held no judgment, which somehow made it worse than accusation. "She doesn't understand investor timelines or valuation metrics. She just understands that her mom keeps leaving." Before Vivian could respond, her phone buzzed insistently. Diana Mercer's name flashed on the screen. She stepped away to answer, turning toward the rain-streaked window. "We need to talk," Diana said without preamble, her voice carrying the clipped efficiency of someone delivering unwelcome news. "There are rumors circulating among the board members. Several have mentioned it to me directly. People are saying you've been spending time at some coffee shop in the Pearl District with a barista. There are implications being made." She paused, letting the words land like stones. "This close to the IPO. Optics matter, Vivian. You're about to become the public face of a company worth 9 figures. You can't be seen." "I can't be seen what?" Vivian interrupted, her voice sharp with the anger she had been suppressing for days. "Having coffee? Watching my daughter make a friend? Being a mother? You know what I mean." Diana's tone softened slightly, the mentor beneath the board member surfacing briefly. "I'm on your side. I've always been on your side. I promised your mother I would look out for you. But the board is nervous, and nervous board members make stupid decisions. Just be careful. That's all I'm asking." Vivian ended the call and stood at the window, watching rain streak down the glass like tears. Behind her, she could hear Sophie and Ethan's muted voices, could feel Marcus's presence nearby, patient and undemanding, and offering nothing except his steady presence. 12 years. She had spent 12 years building Ashford Wellness from a single spa in a strip mall to a company on the verge of going public. Every sacrifice, every late night, every missed moment with Sophie, all of it, had been leading to this moment, this opportunity that would secure their future forever. And now she stood in a coffee shop, her heart pulling her in a direction that made no strategic sense, toward a life her board members would never understand. That night, after Sophie had fallen asleep without saying goodnight, Vivian sat alone in the living room of her penthouse apartment. The city lights of Portland glittering below like scattered diamonds. She looked down at her hands, hands that had begun to remember the shape of signs, the grammar of silence, the vocabulary of a world she had been too afraid to enter. For the first time in years, she had somewhere she wanted to go that was not driven by obligation or ambition. She had people who saw her as more than a CEO, more than a signature on a check, more than a source of returns on investment. But what was she supposed to do with that? How did a life like hers make room for anything that could not be scheduled, optimized, quantified? She had no answers. Only questions and the echo of Sophie's silence and the memory of Marcus's hands moving through the air like poetry she was only beginning to understand. Vivian made her decision the way she made all decisions, pragmatically, efficiently, with a clear assessment of costs and benefits. She would step back from the cafe until after the IPO. It was only a few more weeks. Sophie would understand eventually. The board would stop whispering. Everything would return to normal, or at least to the version of normal that had defined her life for so long. She explained this to Sophie on a Sunday evening, kneeling down to sign the words she had practiced. Sophie watched her mother's hands with an expression Vivian could not read, something closed off and waiting, like a door about to slam shut. Then, slowly, Sophie signed back, her movements sharp with accusation. "You promised." "I know, sweetheart, but this is important for Mommy's work. After the big meeting is over, we'll go back. I promise." Sophie's face crumpled like paper crushed in a fist. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she made no sound. She never made sounds when she cried, and the silence of her grief was somehow worse than any scream could have been. She signed again, her movements sharp and angry, each gesture a blade. "You always promise, you always break it." Then she turned and ran to her room, slamming the door behind her with the only loud gesture she could make. A week passed, then another. Vivian threw herself into IPO preparations with renewed intensity, working 16-hour days, barely sleeping, rarely eating. She told herself she was doing this for Sophie, that the money, the security, the success would all benefit her daughter in the long run, would give her opportunities that Vivian never had. But Sophie was fading. The nanny reported it first. Sophie was not eating her meals, was refusing to engage in her usual activities, was spending hours sitting motionless in her room with her teddy bear. Then came the call from Sophie's school, the teacher's voice, careful and concerned, expressing worry about Sophie's withdrawal from classroom participation. Finally, Vivian came home early one evening to find Sophie curled in a ball on her bed, clutching the space where her teddy bear should have been, her small body shaking with silent sobs. The teddy bear. Vivian realized with a sick lurch that Sophie had left it at the cafe the last time they visited, 2 weeks ago. She had been so distracted by Diana's call, so eager to escape the discomfort of Sophie's cold shoulder, that she had not noticed, and she had not gone back to retrieve it. The next morning, Vivian took Sophie to the pediatrician, her daughter limp and unresponsive in her arms. The doctor ran tests, checked vitals, asked questions that Vivian answered with growing dread. Finally, after an hour of examination, the doctor sat down across from Vivian with an expression of careful concern. "There's nothing physically wrong with Sophie," she said. "All her tests came back normal. But she's shutting down, emotionally withdrawing from the world in a way that concerns me. Has something changed recently? A disruption in routine? A loss of some kind?" Vivian sat in the waiting room afterward, watching Sophie through the glass partition that separated them. Her daughter looked small and fragile, sitting with her arms wrapped around her knees, her eyes fixed on nothing, without her teddy bear. Without her friend, without her mother, really, because what kind of mother had Vivian been? What kind of mother prioritized investor meetings and board member opinions over her child's breaking heart? She pulled out her phone and dialed Diana's number with trembling fingers. "The board meeting," Vivian said when Diana answered. "I need to push it back. Vivian, we've been over this. The timeline is set. The investors are expecting. Push it back, Diana. A week, maybe 2. I don't care what it costs. This could cost you the chairwoman's seat. The board is already questioning your commitment. If I lose my daughter while saving my company," Vivian interrupted, her voice cracking on the words. "What exactly have I won?" Silence on the other end. Then Diana sighed, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer. "I'll see what I can do." The bell above the cafe door chimed as Vivian pushed it open. Sophie's hand gripped tightly in hers. It was mid-afternoon on a Tuesday, and morning light was quiet, a few customers scattered at tables, the espresso machine hissing softly, the smell of fresh coffee and cinnamon hanging warm in the air like a welcome. Marcus looked up from behind the counter. His expression shifted through surprise, then understanding, then something gentler, relief. Perhaps, or welcome, or the simple joy of reunion. Without a word, he reached beneath the counter and pulled out a teddy bear. Slightly worn but carefully cleaned, its button eyes bright as if it had been waiting. He walked around the counter and knelt down to Sophie's level, holding out the bear like an offering of peace. Sophie's breath caught audibly. She reached out with trembling hands and clutched the bear to her chest, burying her face in its familiar fur. When she looked up again, her eyes were swimming with tears, but she was looking at her mother. Vivian knelt down too, bringing herself to Sophie's level. Her heart was pounding, her hands shaking slightly as she raised them to sign. She had practiced this moment 100 times in her mind, but now that it was here, the words felt inadequate for everything she needed to say. "I'm sorry." The signs came slowly, deliberately, weighted with all the meaning she could pour into them. "I'm learning. Will you teach me?" Sophie stared at her mother for a long moment. The cafe seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, Sophie's hands began to move. "Okay, Mom." The tears came then for both of them. Vivian pulled Sophie into her arms and held her tight, feeling her daughter's small body shake with sobs of relief. She was aware of Marcus standing nearby, giving them space while remaining present. She was aware of Ethan appearing from somewhere in the back, hovering uncertainly until Sophie pulled back and gave him a watery smile. Later, after Sophie and Ethan had settled at their usual table with crayons and paper, their friendship picking up exactly where it had left off, Vivian approached Marcus. Her eyes were still red, her professional composure completely abandoned. "Thank you," she said, her voice raw, "for keeping her bear, for keeping the door open," for she stopped, unable to articulate everything she meant, "for seeing her, for making me see her." Marcus did not speak. Instead, he raised his hands and signed, his movements fluid and warm. She was always there. You just needed to learn her language. The afternoon stretched into evening. The cafe emptied of other customers, but no one suggested leaving. Sophie and Ethan drew pictures while Vivian and Marcus sat at a nearby table, talking quietly about nothing and everything about children and loss, and the unexpected paths that life carved through carefully made plans. At some point, Sophie brought over a drawing and placed it in front of Vivian. It showed 4 figures holding hands: a tall woman with dark hair, a tall man with sandy hair, and 2 smaller shapes between them. Above them, in careful crayon letters, Sophie had written family. Vivian looked up at her daughter, then at Marcus, then at Ethan, who was watching with the uncomplicated hope of a child who had already decided this was how things should be. "Family," she signed, her hands forming the word Sophie had taught her. Yes. 3 months later, Vivian stood backstage at the grand opening of Ashford Wellness's new flagship location in downtown Portland. The space was stunning, floor-to-ceiling windows, natural wood and stone, the kind of serene elegance that had become the company's signature. Beyond the curtain, she could hear the murmur of hundreds of investors, journalists, and industry leaders waiting for her keynote address. The IPO had succeeded beyond all projections. Ashford Wellness was now valued at over $1 billion, making Vivian one of the most successful female entrepreneurs in the Pacific Northwest. She had retained her position as chairwoman despite, or perhaps because of the changes she had made. She no longer took meetings after 5 o'clock. Weekends belonged to Sophie. Her calendar now contained entries that would have been unthinkable a year ago. ASL practice, cafe with Marcus, and kids. Sophie's art show. She felt a small hand slip into hers and looked down to find Sophie standing beside her, dressed in a new blue dress that matched her mother's outfit. Sophie's teddy bear was tucked under her arm. She still carried it everywhere, though now it was more talisman than comfort object. "Ready?" Vivian signed. Sophie nodded, her face solemn with the importance of the moment. Then she signed back, her movements playful. "Don't forget to breathe." Vivian laughed, a real laugh, the kind that had become more common in recent months. "I won't. Save me a seat?" Sophie gave her a thumbs up and slipped away to join Marcus and Ethan in the front row. The curtain rose. Vivian walked to center stage, the lights warm on her face, the crowd expectant before her. She could see Marcus and the children in the front row, Sophie sitting between Marcus and Ethan, her small face tilted up with pride. Vivian did not reach for the microphone. Instead, she raised her hands and began to sign. On the large screen behind her, a live ASL interpreter translated her words for the hearing audience. But Vivian's focus was on her hands, on the language she had fought so hard to learn, on the small girl in the front row who was watching with shining eyes. "My daughter taught me that real wellness isn't about the body," Vivian signed, her movements confident now, fluid with practice and feeling. "It's about connection. It's about learning to speak someone else's language, even when it's not your own. For years, I thought I was giving my daughter everything she needed. The best doctors, the best schools, the best technology money could buy. But I was missing the one thing that mattered most, the ability to truly hear her." She paused, letting her gaze find Sophie in the crowd. Today, Ashford Wellness is launching a new initiative. Every location will offer free ASL classes to families. Every employee will have the opportunity to learn basic sign language. Because wellness isn't just about spa treatments and meditation apps, it's about creating a world where everyone can be understood. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Vivian barely heard it. She was watching Sophie, who was signing something to Marcus. "That's my mom," Marcus signed back, his face soft with something that looked like love. "Yes. And she's learning." Later, after the speeches and the champagne and the endless congratulations, Vivian found a quiet moment with Sophie near the building's vast windows. The sun was setting over Portland, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, reflecting off the river below like scattered fire. Vivian knelt down, bringing herself to her daughter's level, a habit now, one of many she had developed in the months since that first afternoon at Morning Light Cafe. "I'm proud of you," Sophie signed, her small hands moving with the confidence of someone who knew she would be understood. Vivian felt tears prick at her eyes. "I'm proud of you too, baby, for being patient with me, for teaching me." Sophie smiled, that rare, full smile that still had the power to stop Vivian's heart. Then she signed the words that Vivian had practiced so many times, that had once felt hollow in her hands but now carried the weight of everything she had learned. "I love you," Vivian signed back, her hand steady, her heart full. "I love you too." Sophie's response was immediate, her grin turning mischievous. "I know." And there, in the golden light of a Portland sunset, a mother and daughter stood together, not in silence, but in a language that had finally become their own.